Now let's take a look at immigration and immigration policy, as well as ethnic relations during the 1920s. Okay, so in 1924, you have a major immigration act being passed by Congress. This is the Johnson-Reed Act. Okay, this is where, for the first time, you hear the term illegal alien being used, right? And so what this act does is it limits immigration majorly, right? This is part of that isolationism, right, where we're limiting immigration, people coming into the United States. And so it really limits immigration quite dramatically, because before 1924, you had about 1 million people coming from Europe into the country a year, right? Like 1 million immigrants from Europe coming into the country. But when we get the Johnson-Reed Act, that's going to drop immigration from Europe dramatically to where we're only having 150,000 people from Europe coming into the country, right? This law also blocked all immigration coming from Asia, except for immigration coming from the Philippines, right? The law also set specific quotas, right? So only a specific number of people could come from certain nations. So yes, the number of immigrants coming into the country after the Johnson-Reed Act is dropping dramatically. The act also creates the Border Patrol for the first time, right? There was no Border Patrol before, but now we have a Border Patrol which is patrolling the borders of the United States, trying to limit immigration from Mexico. You're going to have another act in the 1930s that's going to limit Filipino immigration. Remember, I was saying that the Johnson-Reed Act pretty much canceled out all immigration coming from Asia except for the Philippines. Well, the Tidings-McDuffie Act, 1934, is going to limit Filipino immigration greatly as well, where only 50 Filipino immigrants to come to the United States, the continental United States, per year. Okay, so there's definitely racial bias involved in the immigration policy of the United States in the 20s and as we get into the 30s, right? And remember, when I'm saying that the Johnson-Reed Act was barring immigration from Europe, a lot of that immigration was coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, right? And a lot of nativists looked down upon immigrants coming from those regions, right? So there was racial stereotypes for immigrants from those areas as well. So that's why you see the rise of this type of immigration policy. And also, by the way, the Tidings-McDuffie Act is also going to allow for the independence of the Philippines, right? So the Philippines are going to gain independence from being a U.S. territory to becoming an independent country, right? The Tidings-McDuffie Act is going to allow for that to happen eventually by the year 1946. And again, part of the reason why we're getting Philippine independence is not to be altruistic or to help the Philippines gain independence necessarily. It's mainly to stop immigration from coming from the Philippines. And so the US is willing to grant the Philippines independence to reduce immigration. You also see the rise of something called cultural pluralism during the 1920s. Okay, what is cultural pluralism? Well, this is an idea that's promoted by a man named Horace Callan. And Callan is arguing that America should be proud of its diverse cultural population. Okay, and so this is like a different perspective than the Americanism perspective that we've seen before, right? Like Americanization, where like the government and businesses are trying to force immigrants to assimilate to American culture and leave behind their old culture. Instead, Callan is putting out this idea that no, America should be proud that there's all these different ethnic groups in the United States, right? It makes American culture that much richer. And so it's this idea that, immigrants should not abandon their cultures. No, they should hold on to them, right? And you also, during this time period, have some immigrants starting to call themselves ethnic Americans, right? And this is a term that recognizes and honors their traditional cultural background, right? Instead of just trying to become American and forget where they came from. Okay, so cultural pluralism, it's a different idea. It's, starting to catch on. It's not there yet, but you just see the beginning of this. The Supreme Court is also going to support pluralism to a degree at this time, because you start to see the court passing decisions that invalidated laws that were banning, for example, the teaching of foreign languages in school, right? So you couldn't teach in any language other than English in some schools, like, for example, in Nebraska, right? There was a law against that. right? This is something that came up during World War I. Remember, we were talking about anti-German sentiment. And so you have laws like that. You also had laws that were trying to ban private schools, right? So in Oregon, they did pass a law that banned private schools because they were trying to terminate Catholic schools in the state, right? So, freedom of religion starting to come up there, right? Also trying to undermine schools that may be developed by certain ideological groups, like such as communists or socialists. Like, what if they started the schools? So Oregon's like, no private schools, all public schools. That way we could, stop certain ideologies from being spread amongst our population. So the Supreme Court is going to rule against these laws. They're going to strike these laws down. Right. So in Nebraska, saying that it's illegal to teach in any other language other than English, or in Oregon, where it's illegal to have private schools, both of those laws would be struck down by the Supreme Court. And in a sense, this is supporting pluralism, right? Pluralism in the sense of like multiple different perspectives, multiple religions, multiple ethnic backgrounds, multiple ideologies. Okay, pluralism, multiple. Okay. All right. As we move into the 1920s, we are also going to see the rise of African-American culture. One example of this is the Harlem Renaissance. Okay. So in Harlem, New York, you have a number of African-American artists, writers, poets like Langston Hughes, who are extremely prolific during this time, and they're starting to gain national and in some cases international attention. Okay, this is all in the 1920s. All right, so you have African-American actors, African-American playwrights who are contributing to theater in Harlem, as well as African-American actors who are working on Broadway in New York. Okay, so it's just a kind of a cultural flowering for African-Americans in the area of New York and in other areas of the country. Okay, so the Harlem Renaissance movement is expressing pride in African-American culture. Okay, it's also promoting African heritage. One of the events that helped to give rise to the Harlem Renaissance was the Great Migration, right? So you have large numbers of African Americans migrating from the South to the North, right? And Harlem was one of the destinations in New York for African Americans, as African American neighborhood, right? You also have migration from outside of the country, where you have West Indian migrants coming to New York as well and settling down in Harlem. So you have this sort of cultural center developing, right, which is looking to African heritage as an inspiration for the arts.